Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you're having a great summer, despite the fact that the world continues to fall into chaos and hell. We're trying to make it through. And my guest today is someone who has some experience with that. His name is Todd Gitlin. He is currently the chair of the Communications PhD program at Columbia University, and someone with a significant both personal and professional history with the left. I know Todd Gitlin mainly through his book, The Sixties, Years of Hope, Days of Rage, which is a book that came out in the late 80s that described his own kind of personal relationship with the left, how he was president of Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, during its most turbulent years in the mid-60s. And it's a book that kind of takes on a kind of synthetic approach to describing everything that happened in the 60s. And for those of you who haven't read that or don't really have a knowledge of what went on during that long decade, I heartily recommend it. It's still an incredibly relevant book. And he's written well over a dozen books at this point, someone who is a frequent and I think profound commentator on American society and American politics, and he's incredibly articulate. He's a great writer, and he's got a way of putting things that I find very appealing. I find very has a lot of explanatory power for me. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. We talked about Occupy. We talked about the relationship between Occupy and the New Left of the 1960s, and where he thinks politics are going in the age of Obama, and in the age of increased awareness of income inequality and a changing media landscape. He's someone who's thought a lot about media and how it functions within this this political landscape. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I really, it was a thrill to me to be able to go to Columbia University and sit in his office and set up my podcast stuff and have him talk to me about his experiences through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into today of kind of being on the front row of the American left and writing about it critically. And thinking about it a lot. So he's got some great stuff to say. It was really fun to talk to him. I hope to have him as a guest again in the future. So again, enjoy this conversation with Todd Gitlin. You can find more Nostalgia Trap episodes on StitcherRadio.com. That's Stitcher.com. You can go to nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. Some of the episodes are being featured on jacobinmag.com, which is a great left-wing magazine. And there's a Facebook page for Nostalgia Trap that you can like for more episodes and updates. So keep following the Nostalgia Trap. I appreciate you listening to these conversations. And again, I hope you enjoy this great talk with me and Professor Todd Gitlin. So, obviously you've written a lot about this, and this is something that is a big part of your life. But, when I talk to a lot of the people who were active in the 60s, it seems like, and I think if I remember correctly, you mentioned this in your book about the 60s, that Cuba was a big starting moment in your political consciousness. Was that something that was Cuba just something that captured the imagination of young people specifically in the late 50s?
Well, if we judge from the fact that Fidel Castro came to Cambridge, Mass. in 1959 before a great surge of civil rights or anti-war activity on the campus and filled Harvard Stadium, so it's said, with cheering people, I think that tells you something about the hope on the part that was widely shared that there would be some sort of young, exuberant deliverance somewhere, something developing to be looked at with admiration, even on the part of people who hadn't really formulated anything you could really call politics. But that aside, it's something I did not know at the time. By the way, I mean, I think I was there. I'm not. It might have been before I got there. I mean, you could check the date. I arrived there in September 1959, and I don't remember hearing about it. But I don't doubt that Cuba had some sort of magic dust on it for a lot of people on their way into the New Left. On the other hand, I don't think it was the impetus. I think civil rights was far more important.
Yeah. And in terms of Cuba, it just feels like when I think of the 50s, obviously I think of McCarthyism. So it seems like that was waning by the late 50s. That was, or that young people were rejecting the McCarthyism and kind of.
Well, yes, although you would still find people who were loath to sign a petition because they were afraid that somebody would hold it against them when they were out looking for jobs, either in or even outside the government. I would say there was still a sort of a shadow of reluctance, and then there was defiance. I mean, I think that it's hard to talk about the movement of spirit or zeitgeist, but I think it was possible to feel in 1960, starting with the Greensboro sit-ins, and then even to some degree varying according to place and coloration of people's minds, the sort of hope that Kennedy might spring something loose.
Yeah.
The Peace Corps spirit was part of that. The people who dreamed up the Peace Corps were graduate students at the University of Michigan who were friendly with the people who were cooking up SDS. They were obviously of different weights and tenors, but they were in they were overlapping projects. Let's say burst of idealism, we could call it, and feeling that America was redeemable, and so yes, there was certainly a feeling that the winds had shifted, and even those who were never enamored of Kennedy, much like me, still felt that we were in something new here. It was not the Republican Party. It was not Eisenhower.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about that, I think about Obama's election in 2008 and the hope around that election. I've talked to a few different radicals from the 60s who thought Obama was the real deal, and felt like after a period of 8 years of this George W. Bush administration, this guy was coming along and was that. Having lived through both of those moments, did you feel like it was a similar kind of
Well, I was much more enthusiastic about the potential of Obama than I was about the potential of Kennedy. I mean, I think I mentioned this in my book, apropos Kennedy. The first political rally I went to at Harvard was in Boston, actually, was a rally of the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy.
Yeah.
And one of the speakers was Soapy Williams, G. Menon Williams, the governor of Michigan, who was a liberal Democrat and a big Kennedy supporter.
Yeah.
And he gave, this was in early October of 1960, and he gave a big pitch for Kennedy. And I went up on the platform afterward, and I was not by any means a seasoned radical or a member of anything, and I sort of accosted him and asked him why he had reason to believe that Kennedy would be any different. So that's sort of where I was in October 1960. I had hopes for Obama, as many others did, that he was the community organizer, not the custodian of democratic normalcy. And I think that was, in some important measure, a misreading. But obviously a widespread one.
Yeah.
I mean, when I read his book, Dreams from My Father, and I found that 100 pages or so about community organizing in Chicago, it spoke directly to me as somebody who'd been a community organizer in Chicago. Like, this guy really has been there.
Yeah, and he seemed to be taking up that legacy of the 60s.
Well, that was one interpretation.
Yes.
And in fact, I think there's another streak of the community organizer, which he did actually embody more than the insurgent one, and it was the adjudication of differences among contending parties, which is actually the main work of community organizing in the Saul Alinsky tradition. And that was really where he was. So there was a considerable degree of wishfulness that I shared, and it was not a matter of indifference by any means that he was African American. So that the gates were open. I went and froze at the inauguration, and so a lot of my friends did.
In terms of going back to Kennedy, your skepticism about Kennedy, what was your skepticism about? That he was an establishment figure? Was it about foreign policy?
He was a Cold Warrior. He was not a distinguished liberal. It took quite a while for him to get. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was sort of the grand, dame of American liberalism, had to be talked hard into supporting him.
Yeah.
I had been. Like many others, I think of that period, I adored Adlai Stevenson, somewhat ignorantly, but in any case, he was a popular hero,
Sure.
and I went out, from my high school to hear him speak during the 1956 campaign. So I wept actually watching the Democratic Convention when he was defeated for the nomination.
Yeah.
So but I think to me, Kennedy was a Cold War liberal, and not that liberal. I mean, he had not been. Hubert Humphrey was the guy on civil rights. He had a history.
Which is incredible, thinking about his role in history.
Indeed,
now. Yeah.
indeed. But he was honorable. And
Yeah.
he was also, by the way, I came to learn, because I spent a couple of summers in Washington working on nuclear weapons-related matters. He was also extremely good on disarmament, which Kennedy had not been. I mean, Kennedy was really rather absentee.
Yeah.
I'm sure in my crowd we knew that he'd had a relation with McCarthy, Boston Irish politics being what they are, and so on. We knew who his father was. We knew his father was an appeaser and an anti-Semite, and that was something that mattered more to my father than to me, but it was something of which I was mindful. And I have a dim recollection, actually, of hearing on the radio Eleanor Roosevelt raising questions about his Cold War fervor.
Yeah.
It's just not a memory I thought I've been aware of before. But I said this was a subject under some discussion.
Where were you on the Cold War in terms of that project in 1960? Were you someone that was just completely opposed to it?
I was a 17-year-old kid. I was anti-communist, and I was terribly worried about the bomb.
Yeah.
And I was acutely aware. I was sort of on. I guess I was sort of on the left wing of Cold War liberalism, in that I didn't think that the Cold War or containment was ipso facto wrong. On the other hand, I very quickly, as I studied nuclear weapons that fall, became convinced that the whole deterrence project was unconscionably dangerous, that sort of we needed a different paradigm, and my political education took the form of a sort of an ongoing debate, which I shared with my buddies, about the degree to which we could find some sort of middle way toward what we called unilateral initiatives, which was not unilateral disarmament, but sort of let's test the proposition that we could actually dampen the arms race in the Cold War. So I would sort of oscillate, or I would, it wasn't a matter of oscillation, but I was sort of, one part of me was involved in thinking practically in those terms. And I was a student at Harvard, and Harvard during the Kennedy years, there were connections, we knew professors and so on, so who were on their way back and forth to Washington. So I felt myself to be in the opposition. But when I say we, I mean my crowd, the political peace group Tocsin, Tocsin, named for French Revolutionary Alarm Bell, were on the one hand, partial to Gandhian nonviolent radicalism, and partial to pushing as hard as we could to avail ourselves of the contacts we had in Washington to try to beef up some liberal departure from Cold War orthodoxy.
From what I understand, and I've heard this from someone, that the Kennedy administration read 3 newspapers every morning, and it was the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Harvard Crimson.
It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I would imagine they read others too, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, they were aware of what was going on, and what was going on at Harvard was pretty boisterous. I mean, in April '61. At the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Stuart Hughes, who was a well-known historian, who was one of our faculty advisors, spoke at a rally that was organized by radical graduate students, including Marty Peretz. insisting that Stevenson, who was, remember, still our darling, resign in protest, and we filled Emerson D Auditorium with 300 people.
Wow.
And they must have known that was going on, and they surely knew that that we were to the left of Arthur Schlesinger, and that, and we were not reliably on their team. They, when we had meetings with officials in Washington, and we did a couple of times, they, I think two things happened. One was that they tried to cool us out by assuring us that they really were on our team. Thus, when we organized a big demonstration, big then, 1962, 8,000 people, big, against fallout shelters and nuclear testing and for sort of dampening of the Cold War and so on, Kennedy sent out coffee.
Yeah, I've heard this story.
And I thought at the time, if I'd been out there in front of the White House, I was actually at a meeting at the State Department at the time, I would have rejected the coffee, but that was that was deliberate. I mean, they knew what they were doing, and so on the one hand, they saw us as useful. On the other hand, we saw them as potentially budgeable.
Yeah.
On a number of issues, we had excellent contacts. One of our we had, not myself, but our one of our leaders had very good contacts with Jerome Wiesner, who was Kennedy's science advisor. That's helped get us a meeting in the White House with him and Sorensen and so on during that march. But there were within the group a number of us, and I was one, who were becoming radicalized in the, partly because of the Kennedy approach to Cuba, which we detested. Yeah. And partly, and crucially for me, during the missile crisis, which I've written about in my book, how it was for me and my crowd an ideological crisis, because what it said, first of all, you got to deal with Cuba as such. And in the book, I cite this speech that was extremely powerful to me by Barrington Moore at the rally we organized during the missile crisis. And then it felt to me that we had exhausted a sort of peacenik politics in the process, and that we had to think somewhere else, and that for me was the route into SDS.
Yeah, and so in terms of SDS, I mean, we don't have to go over the whole SDS history, but I do feel like,
thank you.
I do feel like there's that notion that you bring up a lot in terms of the Bob Dylan line, don't follow leaders, and you were kind of reluctant to take on a leadership position in SDS, and SDS itself was kind of reluctant to take that on, and you saw that in Occupy come back, and there's this kind of like reluctance, and we don't want to mirror the structures of the dominant institutions at all.
But there was a difference.
Between Occupy and SDS, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, please.
SDS had a constitution that provided for a presidency. Parenthesis.
Right.
One of the authors of that constitution was an early SDS member named Harlan Joy, whose step-granddaughter is Cecily McMillan, who, as we speak, is in Rikers.
What an insane connection.
How about that?
Yeah, that's amazing.
She's in Rikers as a felonious assaulter on a policeman who was groping her.
Yeah, which is, the Cecily McMillan case has come up on this podcast before, because, it's kind of a chilling moment in terms of, and the way it came up is that how perfect the 90-day sentence was, because it wasn't heinous enough to be cause a revolt on Twitter, but it wasn't it sent a message. It sent a message to anybody.
Her lawyer thought she was going to get 2 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's what she thought. I saw her in Rikers that week, actually, just before.
You saw her?
Yeah, I visited her in Rikers.
And
she thought she was going to get 2 years.
Yeah.
But just back to the point about the presidency, and we can come back to this.
Sure, yeah, because I love
yeah,
talking
it's
about
true that I wrote about this in the book, how 5 of us were nominated for the presidency of SDS. It sounds like a big deal at SDS at this point. June 1963 was an organization with maybe 1,500 members of that on paper. But all 5 of us declined. None of us then thought there should be no president.
Yeah.
None of us wanted to do it. So I take that to be, I still do, I did at the time and still do, a statement of reluctance to step into authority. It was ambivalence about leadership.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which had, as it unfurled over the next years, resulted in SDS abolishing the office of the presidency and the vice presidency and so on. But by the time we now flash forward several decades to Occupy and then presidency, are you kidding?
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't even want to have a single chairman of a meeting.
You think it would have helped the movement to have an organizational structure like that?
You mean recently?
Yeah, Occupy.
I think that, actually,
if it's
I
the one thing Occupy has been parodied in the media, I know the media is another issue, but it's for Occupy never got it together. There was just kind of like a set of disparate
horizontalism
issues.
is the new orthodoxy, and I think it has been inflated. I think that there is a place for sustained organization. But
what do you mean by
I also
horizontalism? What do you mean by horizontalism?
Well, that was the term that occupiers and others.
It's the building of building of like disparate coalitions.
No, not coalitions. Just sort of. Horizontalism is the view, more or less an anarcho-syndicalist view, to place it in the history of the left, that leadership should be shared, that great pains should be taken to include virtually everyone in decision making.
I'm doing my twinkle fingers right
now.
Yeah.
Cecily is quite scathing about that. Cecily is sort of like an old new leftist. In this way.
Interesting.
She believes in organization. I don't know what her view is on organization. She certainly believes in demands, and that's what she was trying to do in Zuccotti Park. Organize in behalf of demands, where she failed.
Well, it makes me wonder if these waves come back again. I feel like as capitalism continues to kind of move into this kind of like hyper unequal place that we are, it seems inevitable that these kinds of waves of revulsion and dissent will come back in different forms. I
agree.
Perhaps Occupy's lack of structure will be a lesson.
My view, what I argued in my Occupy book, was that it was fruitless to preach to the occupiers that they should find a form of organization, a form of decision-making, which was more traditionally organized. Because you were preaching to nobody. They were doing what they believed in. They were not just doing what they believed in doing. They were doing an identity. They were doing their identity. And their identity was finger twinkling and spontaneity and everything's done by working groups and in principle and so on.
I imagine you went down.
So at a certain point, I thought it was, hollow to insist, as I had initially wanted to when I first heard about Occupy. I thought they should have demands and so on. Once I sized up what it was, I thought it was absurd to preach to them that they should be something other than what they were. And my hope was, as we went through the fall of 2011 into the winter of 2012 and we saw the dispersals, my hope was that what I called the outer movement, namely the allies, unions of various liberal groups, so on, would step up and create some sort of soft organization, but in any case, some more organized, focused organization or coalition rather, that could campaign for particular reforms like the so-called Robin Hood tax, financial transaction tax, and so on. And I still think that should have happened, and it didn't. So it might be that when the next waves of spontaneous, more or less, uprising crop up, that maybe some people who were deeply committed to the General Assembly approach to everything, to the twinkling and the
The horizontalism,
the repetition, the human mic and so on, that some of them may well rethink.
Yeah.
Or there may be another political generation which thinks that one lesson they need to learn is not to overdo horizontalism.
Do you think the Democrats lost an opportunity to filter some of that Occupy energy into their political power? Because it seems like the Republicans have been pretty good at grabbing onto the Tea Party and their kind of, so quote unquote populist movement.
Yeah, well,
we haven't seen a parallel thing happening with the Democrats.
Well, there's a structural there are two layers of structural asymmetry here. Mm-hmm. One is that the Republicans are far more authoritarian, so they believe in political structures. Even almost every radical Tea Party person is all for winning party nominations and getting elected and going to Washington and kicking up their kind of
they're beating the left at the grassroots game in a sense.
Well, because they believe in parties,
they
believe in elections, they believe in division of labor, all those things. The left doesn't believe in that. That's extremely different for the most part.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that wait, now I lost it. What was the second thing?
Oh, sorry.
No. About the asymmetry. Well, yeah, sure. The Republican Party is far more conquerable than the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party is a hybrid party. Sort of to be oversimple about it. Half of it is progressive and half of it is Wall Street.
Yeah.
And
you just described Obama, kind of containing both of those things. Yeah.
And to go back to an old obsession of mine, if Ralph Nader in 2000, instead of going off and being Ralph Nader on a stampeding white horse, had set up Nader clubs.
Yeah.
In the Democratic Party, well, we don't know what they would have accomplished.
Yeah,
a Nader caucus. I mean, this idea has been. It was Michael Harrington's old idea in the 70s. The idea of being the left wing of the possible. Teddy Kennedy, in some ways, when he contested the nomination in 1980 against Jimmy Carter, had something like that in mind. They never did it. They never tried to create the caucus as a firm and growing and organized entity the way the Tea Party does. And it may not be possible for Democrats to do that just because of their social identity as, I think, less disciplined people. The right tend toward the bulldozer state of mind. I wrote a book about politics, the bulldozer and the Big Ten.
Right.
And the Democrats are more sort of having, they're sort of lunging around in the Big Tent, and some of them are having parties and they're having pretty good time. And they don't really like politics.
Yeah. Well, there's a paradox right there, or at least a problem.
This is an old story because this also was the case in the 60s.
Yeah, I mean, how much in I imagine you went down and walked around Zuccotti Park when it was happening. Did it feel? I mean, you've been kind of active in the left for decades, and obviously the 60s was kind of a peak for that activity, at least in the country's imagination. Was it bizarre to walk through Zuccotti Park for you? Did it feel like a return to the politics of the 60s, or did it feel like a new generation taking on another mantle?
It was different because partly because of the spread of horizontalism, which in my book I traced to a reaction against the leadership cults that eventuated at the end of the 60s. So that horizontalism, the idea of spokes councils and all that sort of thing, affinity groups, that was terminology that was already in play in the 70s in the movement, for example, against nuclear power, the Clamshell Alliance and so on. These were in part counter reactions against the kind of demonic Leninism of the surviving factions of STS, those who were busily destroying each other and being destroyed. So what I saw in Zuccotti Park was not reminiscent of an STS scene. It was reminiscent of a of an anti-nuclear encampment from the 70s in some ways.
How much did you feel, because many of the most colorful parts of your book about the 60s are describing these street battles between masses of human beings and police. How much did you feel your enemy was the state? How much did you feel your enemy was capitalism? Who was it? I mean, the cops are just the faces of that. But who did you feel were the enemies by the late 1960s? Who or what were you fighting?
Well,
I guess different people have different ideas about that, obviously.
Exactly, and it's
some are going to say, yeah.
I mean, in some way, reminiscent of the Marlon Brando line from The Wild One, where he's asked, what are you rebelling against? Which his answer is, what do you got?
What do you got?
Okay, so what do you got? You got the state, you got the war, you've got racism, you've got imperialism, you've got increasingly as the decade goes on, and I think the war is right at the heart of this transformation of radical spirit. The longer the war goes on, the less compelling are the liberal critiques of the war. Like the war's a mistake.
Yeah.
So this is too awful to be a mistake, and
right.
It's too hard to end. I mean, what if it's just a mistake? Okay, cancel it.
Yeah.
Okay. And now let's do something else. But no, it gets crazier. It gets more murderous.
Mistake is an insane word to apply to a policy that lasts that long.
Exactly. And the movement is growing and becoming more militant, and the policy seems to be not much budged. And so in that setting, I think attention starts turning from, the desire to rectify a foreign policy to the desire to overthrow an elite that stands by it, and that elite is in turn increasingly understood as a board of directors or something like that of a political economic system, so on. So that's the trajectory. And so at any given moment, you find different people at different points on that trajectory. But the whole, I would say, I think it's a fair generalization that the whole spectrum is moving in that direction. You know what I mean?
Sure. About state power, about the cops, about the kind of weapons.
I mean, let me just add something about that. I mean, there was, by 68, especially 69, there would be a lot of loose talk about smashing the state or smashing capitalism and so on. I take that to be less, for the most part, it's less a thoughtful critique. It's more a kind of, fuck them.
Yeah, just
and,
an abstract feeling of anger and resentment. That just kind of... you like you said, it's what do you got and what's in front of you.
What did anybody mean by capitalism at that moment? What did they mean by the state?
Where is it?
There were some self-conscious anarchists. Some of them were very smart. But most of SDS was more, we're troublemakers, we're rebels. And we have in mind, I'm not speaking myself here, but of those who inherited SDS or took over SDS in the latter 60s. The impetus was to have some sort of indeterminate to get on the revolutionary train.
Yeah. I mean, it feels
whatever that was.
Some people argue that the 60s were a pre-revolutionary moment in the United States, and it was almost there. I mean, you described that as
true.
A hallucination at some point.
I do think it's a hallucination, and I had that sense for quite some time, although I very much understood the emotional tug of that.
Well, I mean, I had that during Occupy. I was like, is this it? During Occupy, is this it? Is this when everyone turns around?
No, I mean, I understand why people want a revolution of something or other. I mean, although John Lennon was right about the question he asked, you say you want a revolution. Well, we all want to change the world.
And the country was born in revolution. Right? There's like that.
Yeah,
that
but
kind
it was
of
a particular. I mean, I don't believe that there. I mean, not a Hegelian. I don't think there is an ideal type capital R revolution. I don't think we were in a revolution in the late 1960s, and I because I had at least some part of me protected from the emotional Sturm und Drang and sort of desperate and giddy feelings of the late 60s. I was mindful of the actual social conditions which historians told us were the prerequisites of a revolutionary transformation. And the article that rang loudest to me on this subject was an article by Barrington Moore, the same inspiration from 1962, who was, in the process, who had been working for years on his magisterial book, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. He was an independent Marxist. I guess he was a Marxist of some sort or another. Had never had a full university professorship. He was actually a lecturer at the Russian Research Center at Harvard. And he had been publishing very good pieces in the New York Review of Books, and one of them was about what a revolution is. And I remember reading this piece and thinking, of course, this is right. For example, you don't really have a revolutionary situation as long as the police are in control of crowds. Okay, that sure hadn't happened. The police were still in control. Number two, you don't have a revolutionary situation unless the delivery of the goods is shattered. As long as they can produce, as long as they put bread on shelves and get the bread from shelves to people's living kitchens. No, it's not a revolutionary situation. And I could see this dramatically. I was in Oakland in October of 1967 during the last day of Stop the Draft Week, and when I could just see the collision between the revolutionaries and the people, because the people in general were not cheering on the radical anti-war people blocking the draft bus, blocking the buses carrying draftees to the induction center. They were really pissed off at demonstrators who were dragging potted plants into the streets to obstruct the trucks. And going to work, and they wanted to get to work. I mean, you can see this quite beautifully illustrated in Mark Kitchell's film Berkeley in the '60s, where you see, there's some local
show that movie
people.
All the time.
There's a black woman who lives in the neighborhood, and she's furious at these fucking kids. For I can't remember now. I can't get to work or something. What do they're turning her life upside down. And they're a bunch of privileged kids and so on. I mean, I very much understand that sentiment. What kind of revolution is it? If it's, a bunch of, weirdos, I'm talking here about my friends.
And
so I had a series of
And the irony
doubts.
of that is that group of, weirdos is thinking that they're doing a revolution for these poor black people in a sense, right? And that population is not feeling a connection
to that. It was delusion.
To that.
I mean, to me, the grand delusion, and this becomes one of the central themes of my book, is the idea that you can go it alone. And to me, that was built in from the beginning, right? It's like we Cuban revolutionaries, we 52 people on the grandma, we motorcycle gang, we happy few, we the saving remnant, we the beloved community, the charmed circle. Again, another epiphany for me also right after I got into Berkeley, where this sort of revolutionism was far more intense than it had been in Chicago, where I had been just previously. There was a riot in, I believe it was in support of the French uprising on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, and people were building barricades and so on, and then the police would come out and they would read the sort of the standard riot act of California, which is in the name of the people of the state of California, I, Captain so-and-so. So, of course, the crowd, it roars, we are the people, we are the people. And I'm thinking, I actually wrote a little poem about this I published in the underground paper I was working for. Well, if we're the people, who are all those other people? I mean, what? Come on, come on, people. But, that was this fantasy. I think it was a hallucination. It was a wish, and it was a delusion that this was a revolutionary situation and that we were the revolution. It was just a galloping momentum of its own, and it had an emotional surge that was fierce. So that it was rather. What should we say, poorly reasoned, because the same people who thought this was a revolutionary situation might come back the next day and say, we're on the brink of fascism.
Right.
and they really couldn't make, and you could make a case for either
way.
one, but they were. I think we were probably closer to fascism.
Well,
than to the revolution.
Speaking of fascism, I mean, the Cecily McMillan case came up. The idea of the state was incredibly oppressive during the 1960s to groups, not only like SDS, but for as groups became more radical. The murder of Fred Hampton is one example, but the police were pretty awful. But now we live in an age of the pepper spray cop at UC Davis, and we live in an age where it seems like the weapons of state violence are let loose in a much more dangerous and violent way. Do you feel that, or do you feel like...
Yes, I do. I was not in New York much of the 60s, but my sense is, but where I was, I was in Chicago for 2 years. The police were, truly horrible. But, to go, I'll tell you a little story.
Yeah.
I helped organize a demonstration, a sit-in at Chase Manhattan Bank in March of 1965 against loans to apartheid South Africa.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. 41 of us were arrested. There was a crowd of another 500 or so and cheering us on. The police put us in a van. They were pretty gentle. We went limp. Mm-hmm. I think I had an overcoat that the seam burst on. We were sort of in disguise. We were trying to look like Wall Street types. But they lifted us into the van and they drove us around someplace and they took us to some precinct. I still don't know where it was, but somewhere not far away. And I have a very vivid memory as we're getting out of the van, the cops are asking us our occupation. I guess they're trying to do some paperwork, and they turn to Paul Potter, who was, I guess that year, the president of SDS, who's one of our
we must name that system.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the cop turned to Paul and he said, "What's your occupation?" Paul said, "Organizer." And he said, "Okay, Potter, you're an organizer. Organize these people." Okay, that was a cop whose name I wish to remember. I had met him again. Officer Delaney of the downtown unit of the NYPD, was kind of a mensch.
Yeah.
And we thought it was silly. We've thrown in jail for not very long until we were bailed out. They took our belts away and our shoelaces and so on. But that's child's play. And obviously they didn't want to beat up a bunch of kids, sitting on a street right off Wall Street.
They do now, though.
They do now.
Yeah.
And that's a different world.
Yeah.
So those of us who lived in Chicago had seen plenty of police violence and planting of drugs and beating and eventually killings.
Undercover infiltrators from the FBI,
all
and all
that
kind
yes.
of stuff. Speaking of
But
Berkeley
I
in the
think,
60s, the story about the helicopter coming in and gassing the students at Berkeley, and the
that
woman,
was actually the National Guard, not the police.
and she says, that's when many of us turned around and said, I'm going to graduate school.
Yes.
I'm done with this. We can't fight that.
Yes.
We're the Viet Cong, and they're gonna just wipe us out.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that? And now it seems like the state is showing itself to be much more willing to use those weapons. Do you feel like that means that the left has to go somewhere else and has to take it out of the streets? And
well, you always have to learn. Politics is not pure science. It's a game of maneuver. So your opponents are not the same at time t and time t plus 1. They have a different composition. Their views are different, and your views are different, and you have different potential allies. And tactics also have to be adaptive. You're not. There is. In a way, we're done a disservice by revolutionary imagery of things like, God knows the Chinese Long March or the Lenin's gang, storming the Winter Palace. There is no Winter Palace. There is no Long March, and there is no countryside. So the old imagery, the iconography of basically of 19th to mid 20th century revolution is defunct, and it's so you have to be original.
Do you think that's true just in the United States or worldwide? Are you
well, there's an interesting thing going on. I just wrote an article about this this week. the point's not original to me, and I want to credit it where credit is due. I went to a conference in England last month. It was in memory of Marshall Berman and his work, and one of the speakers there was Göran Terborn, who's who I've read over the years, never had met before. He's a Swedish sociologist, now teaches at Cambridge. And he made a point that I thought, as soon as I heard it, I said, duh, that's so obvious. But it hadn't really occurred to me that the movements of the last year are urban movements. These are movements in cities, they're of cities. And that poses, that's sort of what they are. And to my mind, this is now me, not him, it poses an interesting problem because, for the most part, the units of governance, both political and economic, are not urban. They are national and international. So what does it avail you? I mean, sort of it's the strategic abyss that opens up, or at least cleavage between the scale on which you operate on the one hand and the place where power operates is significant. So, but I do think he's absolutely right. All the movements, whether they were for overthrowing governments in Cairo or winning back some public park, as in Istanbul, or trying to find a way out of the economic collapse, as in the Indignados in Madrid, or the Occupies around the world, they're all urban.
And the Tea Party, and the Tea Party in America are not urban. Right?
I don't. That's probably true. Although in all the demographics I saw did not address the issue of urban. Now that I think
how much did you feel your movements in the 60s, and I say your movements, I just mean, the radical left movements of the 60s were located as urban movements? I mean, when people think of radicalism in the 60s, they think of college campuses, I guess.
That's right. And,
you get by the time you get to Kent State, I mean, it's not in a major city anymore.
No, but that's far along in a trajectory. If okay, where did first of all, where was there some continuity between political radicalism of the 50s and 60s? There were only 2 or 3 campuses. Brandeis was one. Berkeley was a second. I mean, they sort of a structural similarity there. They're within megalopolises. But they're not, in the heartland of the megalopolis.
Right.
SDS grew out of Ann Arbor, which is likewise not Chicago. But of course, important things like the demonstrations against the Un-American Activities Committee in San Francisco were urban.
I guess I'm just kind of wondering about how the left kind of pictured regionalism during this era, kind of how the left kind of dealt with that or didn't deal with that.
It was, interestingly, it was sort of an object of scuttlebutt, but not of theorizing. That I can recall. I mean, SDS grew in, at first, mostly elite campuses. A lot of them were some were big universities like Ann Arbor, some were Swarthmore and places like that, liberal arts colleges, and then it spread so that by 67 or so there was SDS everywhere, and as Dick Flax wrote in some research in 71, the class base of the university seedbeds of SDS by that time had gone downward. That is to say, now, whereas at one point SDS started in places like the University of Michigan, then it moved to places like Michigan State, and by 71 it was in working class universities and community colleges.
At what point did the if you indulged in that hallucination in the 60s at all, at what point did the hallucination break for you? At what point did you feel like your life was going to move on from the immediate kind of let's end the war right now and move into your later life, becoming an intellectual writer?
Well, 2 phases. End of 69, early 70, and I chronicle the experiences that were for me both personally disastrous and sort of intimations of the unsustainability of this course. I mean, I'd been along with a few of my contemporaries from the movement, watching the crazy making of SDS with horror, made some inadequate, relatively feeble gestures to think of some other way to formulate things. A few of us from early SDS tried to draft a sort of a manifesto that would counter the Weather Manifesto. We couldn't really get anywhere. And then in the middle of all that, one friend, Marshall Bloom, who had started Liberation News Service, committed suicide, and then, which seemed like a sort of a crushing of a light, and then comes Altamont.
Another frequently cited as a big bummer.
That was a very big bummer for me. And
you were at Altamont?
Yeah, I was.
Wow.
And
the mood in that movie, Give Me Shelter, that they just capture on film. I just can't imagine.
Tell you the truth,
electricity.
I've never seen the movie.
Oh, really?
I probably should.
Yeah, you should.
For years I've
it's disturbing.
it.
I can understand why you would avoid it, having been there.
And then around that time, somebody I really admired and liked in SNCC, Ralph Featherstone, blew up with another SNCC guy. They were on their way to the Rap Brown trial. Maybe that was early in '70, and I don't really know whether they were carrying a bomb or whether somebody blew them up. But in any case, that was sort of the ending of something. I mean, he was a sensible SNCC person. And then there was the killing of Fred Hampton.
Yeah.
Okay, so all of this says to me, and then of course, right in the middle of that also you have the so-called Weather War Council of the Weathermen in Flint, Michigan, where they take the side of Charles Manson and all that. I mean, this is all one nightmare after another, and it sort of builds up to
it's almost
the
like
townhouse explosion.
The cancer of Vietnam is spreading everywhere in a sense, and even everyone.
Well, and in the meantime, the war is roaring along, and Nixon is about to march into Cambodia and so on. I mean, by the time, if there had been a sensible, rational national organization, Students for Democratic Society, something more sober and enduring and effective might have come out of the Cambodia-Kent State juncture. Maybe in the end it would not have stabilized. I mean, student organizations are notoriously difficult to stabilize.
Yeah.
But so during that period, I got off the wagon. I mean, it was all madness to me, and I hated the sectarianism. Everybody was talking lunacy, so far as I was concerned. Ho Chi Minh versus Mao Zedong. Fuck that. I mean, that was not politics. That was hallucination.
But you still had the power of your convictions. It seems like you just kind of transitioned them to, a different kind of life, a different kind of
eventually
a different
I did.
form of activism in a sense.
Yeah, well, it took me a few years to figure out, how to make a living because I had never thought about that.
You were in a revolution. What do you need to make a living for?
Well, I didn't even think it was really a revolution, but I was sort of in the maelstrom, whatever we would call it. And so I tried this and I tried that. I had some part-time teaching jobs, which weren't very satisfying. And in the middle of all this, I don't want to rewrite the book for you, but in the middle of all this, the women's movement is just surging up.
Sure.
And, many or most of the women that my boys' gang are involved with are telling us we're pigs and we're the problem. And so it was very demoralizing. Period. I tried to write. I mean, I had come to think of myself as a movement intellectual, and I was writing some articles, and I was trying to write some fiction, but I couldn't make it go. I couldn't make a living at it, and I was stuck. So sort of at that point, now we're in 1973, that's when I decided to go back to graduate school. And then I sort of stumbled into a university career with a lot of great good luck. So, during those years, through 70 through 73, 4, I was really at a loss.
Yeah, and it seems like the whole nation was at a loss during that period.
Yeah, well, I mean, women had a different time of it because they were insurgent. I mean, the radical women, the feminists. And you're
talking about on the left specifically.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were in a state of high excitement and for the most part, I supported them, but that was different from being in it.
Yeah, sure.
Especially in that ambiguous way that a man would be. A lot of, I remember after I went back to graduate school, I heard, I was at a conference at Stanford. I started getting interested in media. In fact, that had started for me in the late 60s. I'd written my first article about media in 68, I believe.
Were you aware that media was shifting dramatically during that era?
I was aware, but not in a systematic way.
Yeah.
And I tried to see if academic literature or Frankfurt School literature, anybody was sort of clarifying, and I didn't find it clarifying enough. But I wrote something for a magazine called Leviathan, which is a New Left magazine on the subject. And later, although it hadn't been my original intention, when I went back to graduate school at Berkeley, a professor of mine who had liked that article sort of convinced me there was more to do on that score, and that's how I ended up writing The Whole World Is Watching.
Yeah.
But it's somewhere in that period when we had a little sort of radical media scholars group made up of mostly of people at Stanford. I remember going to a conference down there, and Stuart Ewan, who had a similar background, gave a talk in which he quoted Hunter S. Thompson to the effect of when the going gets tough, the weird turn pro.
Yeah.
And that really spoke to me because I was one of those weird, I mean, I wasn't by any means the weird, I wasn't the hippie sort of weird.
Yeah.
But, that's what I felt it was now necessary to do.
That makes sense.
And a lot of people I knew were somewhere in that vector.
Yeah.
They were becoming doctors or lawyers or university professors and then, of course, there were other directions also. And some people were going and becoming carpenters and working in factories and so on. But that's when I sort of discovered, or I started to get a sense that it was possible to make a life in which my intellect would not be squandered into political crap.
Yeah.
And where I could have intellectual integrity and political work.
No, I mean, that's how I feel about it too.
It would not be identical.
Yeah, sure.
But they would be, in some way juxtaposed or simultaneously in play. In various ways.
I feel that way too. Well, we could talk for a lot longer, but I have one last thing I wanted to add.
If you want, we could pick this up again some other time.
Sure. I mean, I'd love to talk to you again. I just have one last question I wanted to ask you about because when you brought up the end of SDS and the Weather Underground and all that, you must have felt differently than I did when you were seeing, in 2008 when Bill Ayers was all of a sudden all over the news, right? When Bill Ayers and Bernie Dorn are all over the news associated with Obama. Because for the most of the nation, it seems like the media was giving a very distorted view of what it was. And despite the fact that, all that wackiness that was the Weather Underground, the media of 2008 didn't really contextualize it, and
no, of course not.
and
they
so
don't do that.
You must have been in a weird position. I feel like
it was appalling. I was in a state of predictable dismay on every count. The notion that I think I even wrote letters to papers about it, but it's a waste of time. The notion that the Weather Underground or the Weathermen were a 60s organization is just flatly untrue.
Yeah.
They didn't exist until the second half of 1969. That's not a 60s organization, okay?
Right.
Excuse me.
Right.
And, of course, there are many distortions. And, the Black Panther Party was not a civil rights organization either. And by the way, neither was Malcolm X. He was, in many ways a great man, but he would not cop to being a civil rightsnik. So obviously, the history gets
It was just presented as if Obama was a friend of terrorists.
Yeah.
And it felt like, I don't know, when I think of, maybe because I wasn't in it, that when I think of the Weather Underground, I don't like their politics and I don't like what they were trying to do, but at the same time I kind of understand in terms of the hallucination. I understand that the terms of the Vietnam War drove people crazy a little bit.
Yeah.
And I felt like the
more than a little bit.
Yeah, and I felt like the media didn't really.
Some of them were in the army. Some of them were here fighting against the war. There was something of a shared nervous breakdown.
Yeah. Thanks so much for talking to me,
Yeah, you're
Professor
very
Todd
welcome.
Gitlin. I appreciate it.
Sure.